Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you're joining us from around the world. Welcome back to Creation Conversations. We've got a great program for you tonight. We've got John Mackay, we've got Dr. Diane, and Sam's back.
Yay!
Good to see you, Sam. It's good to see you again. It's we're back and we're going. I have no idea whether the super chat and the monetization and everything is all enabled, so check that out. We're on the right track to getting monetization and gifting back, so pray much for that as we continue to try and get that all sorted. But we've got a great program tonight. We're talking about Noah's flood is the general theme. We're also dealing with an organisation called Biologos. We'll speak a bit about their sort of views on the flood and talking a bit about what they believe Genesis says. We're talking a bit about polystrate trees. We've got some wonderful fossils with us. We're going to have a great time. So how is everybody doing? Are we all keeping well?
We certainly
yes, thank
are.
You.
Yes. Yep.
Great stuff, great stuff. John, do you want to kick it off by sharing with us a bit about the ministry and what you've been doing?
Okay, we're here down under in Australia, and we're sort of moving from the end of summer into autumn, and the waters have basically gone. Not the waters of Noah's flood, they went ages ago, but the waters of the flooding over the past 3 or 4 weeks. So our backyard is dry. It doesn't look like chocolate soup anymore. So that's good news. And the folks I was speaking to in New South Wales, they also report their town entry is open now. They can get to their house. So they're all very pleased with that. And Jurassic Ark is lush green. We had to go out and mow yesterday because the grass is so long. So that's how generally the ministry is getting on. We have a newsletter out, so I might give you a look, see what we've done. Sam, can you see your logo there, mate, up the top? Looks pretty cute, eh? This is the first newsletter of the year, print one, and we have these available electronically. So any of you who are overseas, no, we're not going to post it to you. We can't afford all that money these days. And besides, no guarantee of how long it would take to get to you. I sent a parcel yesterday to Camberwell in Australia, and I said to the lady in the post office, what's the best way for me to get this to Camberwell? And she said, by camel? right out on the edge of the desert. And she said, no, it'll have to go by plane to Townsville, by train or plane to Mount Isa, then by donkey or whatever down to Camberwell. It's not going to be guaranteed express post, even though that's what I paid. But if you want this, it is available electronically. And we've got all sorts of reports about my darling wife who's been pretty sick. And Diane, last time you really agitated our show with strange noises. So I got you to write about them in the newsletter. It's a pretty good article. Do you want to tell us a bit about it?
Yes, the strange noises were actually the birds that were outside my windows. When we broadcast this, it's early morning in Australia. So the birds are waking up. And you've probably noticed this yourself, that when the birds wake up in the morning, they like to sing. And that sort of musical introduction to the day is called the dawn chorus. And scientists have looked at or considered what this might have as a function. But of course, they're looking at it from an evolutionary mindset, and they can't really work out what would be a good sort of evolutionary reason to have this, particularly as it alerts any predators as to where the birds are. But I think if they forgot about evolution and looked at it from the biblical point of view, that God created the birds and he created all of the creation to praise him, maybe the birds are just starting their day with praise to the Lord. And a couple of months ago, I read a report that someone had sat down and tried to estimate how many birds there were in the world, and they came up with the answer of 50 billion. That's a lot of birds. So I think it's a good idea for people to start their day with praise. After all, 50 billion birds can't be wrong. So be like them and start your day with praise. It's a good way to see that you have a good day with a good God.
Thanks, Diane. And if you want to read more of Diane's stuff, we have usually 1 or so articles every time. We have our Tasmanian Museum featured. Yes, you're all hearing about Joseph's Museum and Sam's involvement in the UK. We have museums all over the place. I just got an exciting email from Canada today to say their museum display online is finally up and working. I trust. I haven't checked it myself. And look, we have England. Look, there's even Sam there. We told people all about the wonderful new logo he invented. So pray for Sam, and we're grateful he can join us. There's the lady in the top right-hand side. Sorry, top left-hand as you look at it, I think. No, I'm seeing everything backwards here. Top left, thank you. That's Linda, who's left us. And in the bottom, you'll see Karen, who's replaced her. And, of course, our wonderful museum here, Jurassic Ark. So all sorts of exciting things going, including the ad on the front. You mightn't be able to read that, but if you go to our website, we are promoting our Easter convention. I will be in Victoria for nearly 2 weeks, and we will be taking Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday to take you all through what did Jesus say, as it is written in the law and Moses and the prophets. And we'll be taking you all through those to have a wonderful guided tour from Genesis through to Book of Revelation of what Easter is actually all about. Joseph, what are you doing over there?
Well, first of all, John, before we talk about that, just remind everybody they can actually get hold of this newsletter, even if it's not in print. It's still available by signing up to our newsletters in general.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It certainly is. Comes out electronically. And that's different if you're already getting our electronic email, which is an evidence news update. That's different from the creation news, which is all about people, what Sam's doing, what Joe's doing, what we've been finding, etc. So yes, it's free. And as I keep telling people, that's a great price for English people, American people, Australian people, and even European people.
Absolutely, yeah. And so when you go on to sign up to the newsletters, you'll see an option to choose. I think there's 3 different options. So personally, the best thing to do is select all of them. That's certainly what I've done and have done for a long while. But make sure you're signed up to the Creation Evidence News or the Creation Newsletter, and that'll be a great blessing for you as well. Well, what have I been up to? A lot of different things, and what I've been up to has a lot to do with this phone here, which we're going to talk about in just a little while. But before we do, let's tell you about the main thing that's really sort of taken hold of what we've been doing since last week. I finished Creation Conversations. It had been a pretty terrible few days for me and for the stuff we'd been doing, and I ended up exhausting myself to the point of illness. So I've spent an interesting little while with flu and with a fever and all sorts of stuff. Thankfully, all recovered, so praise the Lord for that. But other than that, my time has mostly been taken up trying to organise our UK convention, The Rocks Cry Out, and it is now available to actually book online. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly share the screen, and that'll give you some interesting information about what we've been doing as well. Let's share the screen so you can see this. Hopefully you can see that. Here's our Creation Research Centre website, and it'll be up on our Creation Research UK website as well. And if you scroll down, you'll see the Rocks Cry Out UK Fossil Convention, 26th of September to the 1st of October. Now, this is where you can find out all the details about the convention and what we'll be doing there. There it is there. You'll be joining me down on the Jurassic Coast in Dorset. We've got fossil hunting, Bible devotions, workshops, seminars. It's along the amazing Jurassic Coast. It will be taking place, our base camp rather, will be a place called Moncton Wild Holiday Park. If you want some more details, you can go and find out there. We're going to have a great big marquee, heated, with hard floor and everything all set up so that we'll be able to have our seminars and workshops and morning devotions all in there. We've got the entire rally field part of the campsite to ourselves, so it's nice and safe. Great utilities there as well. There'll be things to buy. There'll be things to get involved with. We'll be down on the beach every day fossil hunting. It'll be absolutely brilliant. This is kind of what the convention is featured around, going out and actually digging up your own fossils, doing the field trips, getting involved. There'll be workshops and seminars there as well. You can find out more details about that and the kind of stuff that we're going to be doing there, including some of our speakers as well who are going to be there, and there'll be more speakers announced as we go, because we're currently confirming them and getting them all together. There's all the details and the pricing, and the tickets are live on our Creation Research store, which is our UK site there. So you simply go, follow the links, and select how many tickets you want to book, and any extra. There is an early bird offer, 20% off per person until the 1st of May. So go and check that out. Go and grab that together now. It'll be well worth it. It'll be a really, really fantastic opportunity to go and dig up your own fossils and do everything else as we go as well. So great stuff. Go and check that out. Well, that's what I've been mostly up to. So let's move on to our fossil feature, because I've got quite a number of fossils here that I want to share with you, and then we're going to read a little bit of scripture, and we're going to get into our main topics of this evening, which is really dealing with Noah's flood, polystrate fossils, and the like. All right, we've been pretty busy this week working on a new project. It's a project we've been working on for a little bit of time now. We can't really say anything about it, but Lord willing, we will be able to share with you the full details soon. And it is big and it is exciting. But one of the things that we've been doing as part of this project is looking at lots of fossils and also looking at how fossils form. Because the standard thing, which I know, when you go out and speak to people, most people think, oh, a fossil is something that has turned to stone. It's a creature that's turned to stone. It's a plant that's turned to stone. And the reality is, well, sometimes they've turned to stone or been preserved in mud. This is one example. This is a trilobite. Our trilobite, 1, 2, 3. It's got 3 lobes. It's a 3-lobed thing. That's literally what trilobite means. Right? Here's a nice little trilobite, and it's made of mud. It's been encased in mud. It's been entrapped in mud, and it's pretty much been preserved in mud. This is an example of a fossil, a creature that has been, well, you could say it's been turned to stone. It's certainly preserved in stone. But the reality is most fossils, or a lot of fossils rather, are not actually like this. There's a little trilobite, but here's a fossil that was actually already a stone before it even got buried. I mean, let's hold it in front of my face so we can try and get it into focus here. John knows very well what this is. This is a stromatolite. It grows. It's like an algae bacteria film that grows and produces these hard layers of limestone and calcite, and it pulls it up. And the reality is, because it's already a fossil, because it's already stone, it doesn't take millions of years. It doesn't require being around for vast periods of time in order to fossilize. It can happen very quickly indeed. There's a stromatolite, already a fossil. Then you've got other things, other fossils which don't really actually need to be buried or do much at all. Not only are they already quite hard, if you go and dig one of these out of the permafrost in Siberia and Alaska, this is a mammoth tooth. It's a pretty big tooth, but the reality is teeth again, they're already hard. They're made out of minerals, and so if you stuck this in a freezer mixed with mud at about -40, you've got pretty much the same conditions that it's been lying preserved in the permafrost up in the North Arctic. It hasn't turned to stone either. It's still pretty much in the same condition that it was when it was inside the elephant's mouth, and so that hasn't been turned to stone either. And then you've got dinosaur bones. Now these are both vertebrae. This is a nice vertebrae off of a Spinosaurus. You know, the one with the big spines on his back, hence the name Spinosaurus. This is actually one of our UK examples. It's a pretty nice big backbone. This is from one of those big Titanosauruses, and it's got some beautiful detail, if we hold it up to the camera, in its honeycomb structure. I mean, it's absolutely wonderful. One thing you can see is that its honeycomb, its sort of internal bone structure, has been filled up with minerals. Now, again, this hasn't turned to stone. The actual bone that was in the dinosaur is still here in my hand. This is permineralized. Now, permineralization is when you have the minerals go into the bone, they permeate the bone, they encase and entrap the bone, and they infill the bone with minerals, hence preserving it. And you can see some of these minerals inside the bone structure. I mean, there you go. See, the bone structure is still there. The actual bone is still there. It's been encased, and entrapped and infilled with minerals per mineralization. Now, what's significant about this? Now, one of the things that we've been doing, of course, and you've heard lots of people talk about, is soft tissue inside dinosaur bones. Now, if dinosaur bones are really bones that have turned to stone, you might be wondering how that's possible. Well, here's an example. This has to do with the project that we've been working on. This is an example that we used. Now, here we have a fossil teddy bear. Now, John, you also produce these fossil teddy bears in Australia, don't you?
We certainly do, and the kids love putting a teddy bear in under our stalactite machine and then watching it over the next month or so go rock solid. And then they discover something very interesting about what's inside it. So what I can see you've chopped that in too, Joseph. So what's inside it?
We have indeed. So this teddy bear is permineralized. Remember permineralization? It's the same process, and process is the key word here. It's the same process as what fossilized this dinosaur bone. Minerals have permeated the teddy bear, they've encased and they've entrapped the teddy bear in minerals. In this case, it's a limestone. All right, you grab your teddy bear and you chop it in half. What's inside? Hey, it's still got the stuffing inside. It's soft and squidgy in there. There's still soft, squidgy stuff inside. Because of the type of process that is actually used to permineralize this teddy bear, the minerals haven't had chance to permeate into the inside of the teddy bear and fully permineralize it. There's still lots of soft, squidgy stuff inside. Now, in exactly the same way,
if I can interrupt you there, Joe, what our kids find, the school students, and by the way, the good news is after nearly 2 years without high schools, they've started to book back into Jurassic Ark. Praise the Lord, COVID is on its way out, at least in terms of the law. So that's an encouragement. When they come there, what amazes them is the actual layer of lime acts as a preservative. So it keeps the oxygen out, and all the soft ooey gooey stuff that normally if you threw it on the ground it would rot and get wet and decay, it's still in perfect shape.
Exactly, yeah, just like what we've got here. Perfect, almost as if it was, a fresh teddy bear from yesterday. Now, this is permineralized, it is preserved, but the inside is exactly the same as when it came out of the teddy bear manufacturing company, right? Now, when we're talking about fossils, we have a permineralized dinosaur bone. Exactly the same process as the teddy bear, and it's been preserved, whatever there is inside. It's buried it so quickly, it's buried it so beautifully, it's preserved it so brilliantly. Anything that's inside that hasn't become fully entrapped, fully impregnated, fully permineralized will be preserved beautifully. So when you take a big bone like this, with all of its lovely honeycomb structure and everything else inside there, look at that, absolutely fantastic details. You can get this, you can chop it up, and just like the teddy bear, you can scoop out the ooey gooey stuff inside. It can sometimes be slightly more delicate than that, but the reality is you can get some incredible stuff out of these bones, including nerves with and veins and nerves with nerve endings on them, and some incredible details, sometimes even preserved remains of bacteria and stuff inside these as well. It's absolutely remarkable, but this is the kind of thing that we're doing this is why hands-on is so important, and this is part of the reason that we're doing the convention and making it so hands-on, because you actually get to come out and see the evidence for yourself. You get to dig up the fossils, handle the fossils, and you actually get to participate in real research that deals with dinosaurs and everything else besides. So check out the convention. Make sure you book onto that. There's a nice little spattering of fossils from our museum collection. Support our museum project here in the UK and around the world. Get behind it. It is we've got some wonderful, brilliant, world-class fossils and displays and everything else. All right, let's have a quick look and see. We've spoken about a little bit of stuff. Let's see if there's any quick questions. And what we're going to do, we're going to start off by reading a little bit of scripture, and then I'm going to hand over to Diane. Is that correct? Excellent. Well, let's have a quick look, Sam. Is there any questions or anything that have come through so far? Any comments? Or let's dive into the next part.
Yeah, we've had one question from George Bond. He says, ask Joseph, is there a date stamp on those fools?
Is there a date stamp? No, there isn't, unfortunately. It would be quite useful if there was. No, there's not a date stamp on those fossils, so if you want to determine the date, you have to use other means and other interpretations. But John?
I've got to sort of slightly disagree there, Joseph. With some of the fossils I've got, we do have a date stamp. It's on the bottom of the beer bottle because we actually found an old abandoned shipyard that had been bulldozed into the sea because it was an illegal shipyard. They'd got word that the government was coming, the police were coming to shut them down. So they bulldozed everything into the ocean, whereby in the next 50 years, the sea, the sand, the shells glued everything together. And we know when it happened at the latest because the date stamps are on the beer bottles pushed into the sea as well. So only when you've got human intervention do you get a date stamp. But what you said, Joe, is absolutely right. They don't come with a, hi, I'm Brontosaurus. I was buried here 100 million years ago. That's all guesswork. Thanks, George.
All right. Let's turn to scripture. And we're going to, remember our topic is Noah's flood. We're going to be reading the whole of Psalm 29, which has a connection to the flood, and we'll talk about that as we go. And John, maybe you'd like to comment on that before we hand over to Diane. But it's quite important because Diane's going to be talking about worldwide or local flood and some of the issues with that. So Psalm 29, a psalm of David. Give unto the Lord, O you mighty ones, give unto the Lord glory and strength. Give unto the Lord the glory due to his name. Worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness. The voice of the Lord is over the waters. The God of glory thunders. The Lord is over many waters, and the voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is full of majesty. The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars. Yes, the Lord splinters the cedars of Lebanon. He makes them also skip like a calf, Lebanon and Syron like a young wild ox. The voice of the Lord divides the flames of fire. The voice of the Lord shakes in the wilderness. The Lord shakes the wilderness of Kadesh. The voice of the Lord makes the deer give birth and strips the forests bare. And in his temple everyone says glory. The Lord sat enthroned over the flood, and the Lord sits as king forever. The Lord will give strength to his people, and the Lord will bless his people with peace. John.
Okay, just a few comments. I will be talking about this at the Easter Convention in Melbourne too, but in reality, two things of interest. One is I knew a verse out of this psalm way before I'd become a Christian, because I've always been a bit of a traveler. So I used to hop on my push bike and ride for 100 miles. We used to have non-metric measurements in those days. And in doing so, I passed a little bush church, and it had worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness. And even though I was not a Christian, even though I wasn't part of a church, I thought that's a neat thought. I don't know why it interested me, but I really liked worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness. I didn't know the rest of it. You see, this God has power to destroy forests in his, just with one word. I mean, that's power. But then it goes on to say, the Lord sits as king of the flood forever. And what interests me now about this psalm, the word flood there, the only place you find that word used is in Genesis about Noah's flood. You see, the Hebrew people, they don't talk about the 2011 flood or the 2022 flood. They talk about Mabul, that's the Hebrew word for Noah's flood, or they just have a local flood. A really important point. This psalm is about Noah's flood. This psalm is about floods that are not just local. This psalm is about a flood which is global, Mabul. And this king sits as Lord forever. And hence it led me to love that last verse. He gives his people peace. And some of us have had pretty rough weeks. So thank you, Lord, that you can destroy a forest. And I'll be talking about forests that have been destroyed in my polystrate one. And thank you, Lord, that you have strength to give us peace in the midst of troubles. Diane, you want to talk about a group that sort of says, don't believe Noah's flood is actually global. Take it over, Diane. Tell us a little bit about Biologos and what they're saying and how to deal with it.
Yes, well, a few years ago, we had a question sent into our Ask site, that's Ask John Mackay, where someone had read an article on the website of an organization called Biologos, which claimed to believe the Bible. Anyway, this article was saying, well, the story of the flood is just a theological story. It's an epic story with a theological message, and it wasn't really a worldwide flood. Now, they're not the first people to say that, and they certainly won't be the last. Over all of the years I've been involved in things to do with creation, that's a regular story that comes up from the non-Christian skeptics as well as the theistic evolutionists who want to somehow massage the Bible into fitting the standard evolutionary picture of the world. So we thought, well, this is something that regularly comes up. It's not just Biologos. It's worth giving it a proper answer. And we can do that. We can stand our ground quite firmly. And so let's have a look at how we can go about this. We don't need to fear. We just need to think about it clearly. So let's have a look at whether this is a worldwide or a global flood. If we just go to my slides here, and so there are in fact 5 different things we can say to answer this challenge, and we will go through all of these in this whole program. I won't do them all, but first of all we need to look at what actually Genesis says, and this is a good principle we need to use for anything to do with answering the skeptics. Know what scripture actually says. A lot of skeptics don't know, and don't be afraid to check out the science, and we'll be doing a bit of that as well. And Joseph will have a bit more to say about what Genesis actually says, but always start from Genesis, right? And then take up the challenge. All right, what if the flood was local? What does that do to the story? Then look at the testimony of Jesus and the apostles, particularly if the objection comes from someone who claims to be a Christian. If they do, then they have to submit to the words of Christ and to his apostles. What's written in the New Testament, it's not just a Jewish myth that lives in the Old Testament. And then we have evidence from the world around us, from human history and also from the earth. And we'll share a bit about that. John has some very interesting things to say about that later on. So let's have a look at the Genesis narrative. Now, it's 3 whole chapters, so it's quite a long way. We won't do that all right now. But we need to look at what God says about the flood. So his intention is very clearly stated. And he says, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life under heaven. So he's talking about all the air-breathing, land-dwelling animals, right? Everything on the earth shall die. So we're not talking about any sort of local fauna there. God has made it very clear this is what his intention, and he says that he's going to destroy everything with the earth. If you are not familiar with the narrative of the flood, it's a good idea to just read it straight through and follow the thoughts as they come. And in fact, what God said he would do, that's what happened. Towards the end of the story, we are told everything on dry land in whose nostril was the breath of life died. So all of the land-dwelling, air-breathing animals died out, and then it's reinforced in the next sentence. He blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the earth, man, animals, creeping things, and the birds of the heavens. Remember the birds. They are important. They were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left and those with him in the ark. So that's quite an emphatic statement that the flood wiped out all the land animals and all of the people who weren't on the ark. That's not a local flood. That's definitely a worldwide event. And the extent of the flood is also clearly described. The waters prevailed mightily on the earth, or so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. Now, that's very clear. the whole Earth, the whole planet, was covered with water for a time, so that even the hills weren't visible. So the Genesis narrative very clearly states that it is a worldwide, or it was a worldwide flood, and we'll hear more about that later. So let's take up the challenge. All right, if it was a local flood, what does that do to the story? Does it make the story make any more sense, or does it reduce it to a sort of inconsistent, silly story? Because if it's an inconsistent, silly story, why should we trust the one who told it or the one who sent it? So let's have a look. All right, if it was only a local flood, why would Noah have to build an ark? Noah and the animals could migrate and the birds could fly just over the hills and far away into the next valley. And remember, it was God who sent the animals to the ark. Noah did not have to go and catch them or anything like that. So if he could direct animals to go to the ark, he could certainly make them migrate to another safe location. And if it was only a local area that was going to be affected, well, more animals and birds could be saved by having them migrate into the next valley. So it doesn't make any sense that Noah would have to build an ark, yet it's made very, very clear in the Genesis narrative that the purpose of the ark was to preserve those animals so that they could replenish the earth after the flood, and that was the only way that they were going to survive. Now, the other interesting thing is, consider the size of the ark. Now, this is a model of the ark that we have up at our Fossil and Garden site, our Jurassic Ark site, and we have to remember the ark was not a ship. So we can't even compare the internal volume with the internal volume of an ocean liner, right? It was much more, if you're going to compare it with any sort of floating vessel, a barge would be a better comparison. Right, okay, it's more like an elongated box. Now, it was too big for just a regional fauna, and we have to remember it wasn't individual species that were being preserved, it was kinds. Now, kinds will include many different species, right, but they're all the same kind. So there are a lot less kinds than there are species. And if you're only going to have to preserve a regional fauna or a one coastline, one river valley, think of how many unique kinds, not just species, but unique kinds there would be in one river valley or in one coastline. It wouldn't be all that many, and yet we are told this was the only way that the kinds were going to be preserved. But the ark was an absolutely enormous vessel. So if we just put the measurements onto our model, okay, our model is nowhere near this big, of course, okay, we're told in the Bible 300 cubits by 50 cubits by 30 cubits. All right, we don't measure things in cubits these days. So modern measurements, now we're taking the most conservative value for a cubit. There were different cubits in ancient times when they measured things in cubits, but we'll take the smallest version, the most conservative, and you end up with these sort of measurements. Now, that is really, really huge. To get an idea of how huge that is, you couldn't fit the ark onto a football pitch. You'd have a hard time getting it into a football stadium. A Premier League football pitch is 105 by 68 metres. So even diagonally, you couldn't fit it actually on the playing area. You might get it into the whole stadium. So we're talking about a seriously very big structure, far too big for just preserving a regional fauna plus 8 people. Mm-hmm. Now, think about the duration of the flood. We've just had some floods in Australia, and there have been floods in other parts of the world, including the UK. How long did they last? Now, it's only been a matter of weeks down here in Australia. Sometimes it's only a matter of days. And those are seriously destructive floods that actually do completely cover people's houses. People have drowned. There's been all sorts of dreadful destruction. But they don't last for the time that the flood lasted, as described in the Bible. So let's have a brief look at that. And in fact, the time of the flood is one of the most meticulously and well detailed periods in the Bible. So we're told very clearly the flood started on the 600th year of Noah's life in the second month on the 17th day. Now notice very clear and specific dates. The story of the flood is filled with specific dates, times, real events in real history. Nothing fluffy or fairy tale like, no once upon a time. Lots of details, lots of facts and figures. Now, most people only know about the water from the flood from the 40 days of rain, okay? But we've also got the fountains of the great deep. So there's masses of water from two different sources, and we're told that the waters prevailed for 150 days, right? That's about 5 months. So not just a few days or a few weeks. So the waters prevailed for all of that time, and then we had to wait for the waters to go down again before Noah could get out of the ark. So we're told the waters receded, the ark grounded on the 17th day of the 7th month, and on the first day of the 10th month, they could see the tops of the hills. So the earth, they could only be reassured that the earth really was going to dry out at the beginning of the 10th month. And even then, it was a long time before it was safe to leave the ark. They had to wait for God's instruction, and Noah was told to leave the ark on the 27th day of the second month of his 601st year. So the total duration of the flood, 1 year and 10 days. That's nothing like even the most catastrophic flood or tsunami that we've seen otherwise in history. And finally, a very, very important point for the authority of Scripture, for God's character, and also for our own future. God promised that he would establish his covenant and that never again would all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood. So never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. Now, we can trust God because he hasn't destroyed the earth with a flood, with a worldwide flood, but there have been a lot of local floods. We've just had some in Australia. There have been in other countries as well. There have been massive tsunamis. Even in my lifetime, I can remember quite a few. Right throughout history, local floods, local tsunamis. But God promised he wouldn't do what he's just done again. Now, if he was only talking about a local flood, or if what had just happened was a local flood, the people of Lismore and Gympie actually could rise up and say, well, you didn't keep your promise to us, and to the people who have been wiped out by massive tsunamis and floods throughout human history. So very important point to remember there in the light of how we can trust God and in the light of the gospel. So let's look at the testimony of Jesus and the apostles. Well, in the book of Hebrews, which was written by a well-educated Jew who obviously knew all of the Old Testament very, very well, because it describes a lot of things that we learn about how Old Testament worship worked. He talks about a whole lot of people, real people in real history, who are described as people of faith. And Noah is there, listed among all these real historical people. So it's very obvious he regarded Noah as a real person who experienced this real event in history, because the thing that he is described for having faith in, that he believed God, he acted upon it when he was warned that the world was going to be destroyed and he would need to build an ark. But more importantly, we have the testimony of Jesus and the Apostle Peter, because both Jesus and Peter linked the worldwide flood of Noah's time to a worldwide judgment that is coming when Jesus returns. Now, he is coming as the conquering king in judgment to judge the whole world. That's everyone on earth. And Jesus and Peter made it very clear that what happened in the past with Noah is a picture of what is going to happen in the future. Now, it's not going to be by a flood of waters, it's actually going to be by fire. But the important thing is it will involve judgment of the whole world. Now, if the flood in the past didn't involve judgment of the whole world, what about the judgment that's coming? And that is important in terms of us sharing the whole counsel of God, where we have to proclaim Christ as creator, judge, as well as savior, and also as our coming king. We also have the testimony of other cultures, it's not just in Christian cultures or Jewish cultures. Almost every culture in the world have stories about a great flood, and it is described as a unique event. It's not related to any sort of natural disaster that they've experienced in their own lifetimes. This is best explained by biblical history. It's a bit hard to explain if all of these cultures sort of evolved separately without any interaction from themselves. Why would they have a story that has a lot of elements in common? It does fit with biblical history. After all, if everyone in the world or every culture in the world is descended from the dispersion at the Tower of Babel, which was only a few hundred years after the flood actually happened, and within the lifetime of Noah and Shem and others who actually survived it, you then get dispersion into all of the different people groups and cultures. Now, as people moved away, they would have forgotten things. The story would have been corrupted because they did forget about God, or they openly defied God. I mean, that's why they were sent away from the Tower of Babel, because they had openly defied God. So there is a lot of loss of detail and a lot of corruption of the story, and some of the cultural ones are rather fanciful, and that gives the skeptics an excuse to say, oh, well, this Noah's story is just another one of those. But no, it makes more sense if Noah's flood is the original, if the Genesis story is the original. All of the others result from loss of detail and corruption of the original story. And of course, finally, if the flood did actually happen on a worldwide basis, there will be evidence. It will have left its mark in a very big way on the earth. As we look at the landforms, as we look at the rock layers, we can actually go out into the real world and we can see the evidence. And if we go back to John's got some very interesting evidence to share with us now. So if we go back to to us, thanks, Joseph.
All right, thank you, Diane, and some great points there. Sam, do we have anybody who got any questions on anything Diane said come in just yet?
So we've had a question, it's sort of like a two-parter question from George Bond. So he said, is it possible to construct a flume experiment that can simulate tidal action, water running in one direction, and then shift and tilt it so the water goes in the opposite direction? Interesting what results we could get with the layering.
Okay, it is possible, George, and with donations from people who ask lots of questions, we can actually go ahead and reverse our flume. In our latest newsletter, by the way, if you subscribe for free, you'll find our latest flume experiment is actually listed there on the actual formation of waves. And some of you know that there's a bit of a mystery in the Grand Canyon and the Coconino sandstone, where you've got massive dunes underneath the inside the sandstone itself. And what's interesting is on the down current side, you have lots of amphibian footprints and insect and other animal footprints. But the interesting thing is there's no bones in the Coconino. It's almost as if the animals were climbing up desperately to get away from the water, and then the water just takes them off the top and sweeps them away. Of course, what we've been able to do in our flume experiment now, and I'll hold this up a bit closer to the screen, you've got our flume at the top, there we are. Then underneath it, you've got the current showing on the right-hand side there, or left-hand side. Forgive me if I get it all backwards, I'm an Australian. I live down under. And then you'll find the current is actually making many layers, and you find all sorts of waves forming, and see those, well, I guess you could call them dunes. That's what they turn out to be, sitting on top of very mixed up currents, all happening in the one flume tank. So yes, George, and thanks to those of you who've been inspired by George's question to send more donations to Creation Research. Do we have our what do you call that? Snap money? Not a, what's the name of that?
No, it doesn't appear to be live, the super chats, but all the details for donating are in the description below, so please do donate. Lord willing, next week we'll have the super chat and everything else back up and running. It seems to be half working, the monetization side of things, but pray much that we can get all of that sorted for next week.
Okay, well, I'll take on my section.
Carry on, John.
Yeah, that's right. My section deals with fossil trees by and large. I first got involved in this many years ago because, you know, my dad was involved in mining. I've been playing around with rocks since I was a little kid. My mum said I used to break rocks open simply to find out what was inside them. And of course, sometimes you find fossils. I remember making my first gift for the lady who's now my wife. It was a rock, and I actually carved it and shaped it, and you know, all sorts of things you can do with rocks. But as you keep looking around the world, particularly in coal mines and things like that, you do come across some vertical trees. Now, let me take you on a trip. Let's put these slides up, Joe. I'll just shift my water bottle out of the road here. There's our new logo, courtesy of Sam, and the colour background, courtesy of Australia. I reckon the combination's pretty good. That's our logo you'll see us on. And don't forget to go to creationresearch.net, sign up either in the UK one or in the Australian one for the newsletters, and keep up to date with all of this. All right, now there's a set of coal seams. That's how it was the first time I actually saw it. Do you see the top black layer? Do you see all the whitish pink layers in between? Do you see the black layers at the bottom? Do you see two vertical trees that are actually poking up from the bottom? Now, Dr. Beryl Nasher reported when she first saw this, the trees went from top to bottom. Perhaps I better tell you where we are. We're actually, there's my first diagram of it. You are in the upper pilot seam. Pilot relates to ships, ships relates to wharves. The pilots were the ones who guided the ships into the harbour. We're not far from the main entry to Newcastle. Upper pilot seam, lower pilot seam. You'll see my trees sketched in at the bottom there, and there's ash shale sediment in between, lots of layers. That's why one reason we do the actual layer experiments in our strata machine, so keep watching. Of course, I did end up giving some papers on this to the Sydney Basin Coal Conference. They were not very popular because by the time I did the papers, here's how small the trees had actually gotten. Notice they're no longer going from top to bottom. There's the top layers of coal, there's the bottom layers of coal, and there is the contorted layers of ash and shale in between. Okay, now if you go one step closer, we went back and we did an experiment. Dr. Beryl Nasher and others said the trees used to go from the bottom layer to the top layer, from the bottom coal to the top coal. And normally these sort of trees are interpreted as having lived there, died there, been buried there. Okay, question. How is coal supposed to form? Slowly in a swamp over millions of years. What sort of trees are they? Well, here's my old colleague, Jeff Smith. He's a Christian guy who's died. I'm waiting to see him again, get up there in heaven. We won't worry about fossil collecting up there in heaven, I'm sure, or in the new heavens and new earth. But what are we doing? We're refinding some trees that have started to appear. Do you see his green shorts there? Glorious Australian fashion. And that portion, there was a little cliff fall. And the portion right beside his shorts had showed up. So I said to Jeff, let's go and see where this tree goes. So we went out early in the morning, we stayed till very late, and we did some excavating. Hey, one reason I love abandoned coal mines, in a very tiny place is you can dig and dig. And well, in those days, you didn't need to worry too much about regulations. Well, see the bottom of the coal seam now? Bottom of the tree, by the way. This turns out to be a pine tree. Nobody has disputed that classification at all. And it's coalified, particularly on the outside. And right at the bottom of the slide, that's where it sits on the top of the lower pilot seam. And then it goes up and it goes up. Can you see the hammer in the middle of the picture? Yes, we were here because we wanted to check a few things. There's my hammer, which is now at the base of the picture. I've expanded the picture. Can you see the black stripes going across the seam? Okay, the black stripes come from left to right. The tree goes from bottom middle to bottom top. Now the black stripes running horizontally turn out to be coal seams. So even if we never managed to prove this got to the top well-known upper pilot seam, we've established one thing. It's gone through many coal seams. Some only are 2 centimeters or an inch thick, some 4 or 5 centimeters thick. There are hundreds of coal seams running across this tree. In fact, if you go a bit closer, you will see there's all sorts of volcanic ash at all sorts of angles. There's flat layers with black coal in. There's the tree, which is carbonized, it would appear on the outside, and it's still going up. Yes, we're above the multi-coal section layer. Let's go one step further, because here's Jeff. He's my scale. There's his green shorts again. And now we're standing on top of the upper pilot seam. There's more ash. There's more seam. Now, the interesting thing is this coal seam had been known since, well, Beryl Nasher was the professor of geology way back in the 30s. Man, this is an old cut. It was a test cut. And what's interesting is these seams, well, let's see. We mapped where we thought the tree might turn out. We dug, and there we are. The tree comes right up through the coal seam and out the other side. Dr. Beryl Nasher was not making it up. There are trees that start on the bottom of the coal seam, then they go all through the little coal seams, then they go to the top coal seam, they go clean through the top coal seam. Just to prove it to you, here's yours truly, standing on the top coal seam. There's the tree, exposed, right beside me. There's the top of the coal seam, exposed now a little to the right of me, where I'm standing. And what you find is that's the top of the coal seam, and the tree pokes out. Now, when you go down and have a look all the way around, oh, by the way, if you want to know what happened to that coal seam, we reburied it and we put a waterproof note inside a waterproofing box. And the note said, found by John Mackay and excavated by John and Jeff. And we put the date on it because we didn't want these evolutionists coming along and destroying the evidence without a record of us being there. And we photographed everything, including this tree, which we found on the other side. That went right up to the top and it pokes into the coal seam. Now, stop a moment. Trees, pine trees, coal, swamps over vast ages. If you have a pine tree going from one coal seam up through many coal seams, up into the next coal seam, the next coal seam is a major one because they used to mine it. The bottom coal seam is a major one because they used to mine it. The ones that are only 1 inch or 2 centimeters thick, they're not mined at all. They're just waste. And these trees were pine trees, softwood. There's no way in the world they'd last over vast periods of time to be buried in yet another swamp. Okay, down the hill and round the corner. Here we are at a place called Redhead. Now, at high tide, that water comes right in there and you can't get around that headlands. So it takes sort of people of well, what could one say? Different IQ to actually walk around there, because the possibility is you get a sudden wave, you'll actually be trapped. And look what we found. Fantastic. There in the next little alcove was a fossil tree standing upright. No branches and no roots. And it's standing upright, going right through a small seam, a hardened seam, No coal visible there, but it's a standing upright tree. It's going through many layers. Many layers, say it in Latin, polystrata. Yes, you can see we are well equipped. We had to clean it off. So we took a broom. No, we didn't ride the broomstick there like some of our enemies might suggest. We took it to clean the cliffs. Not a problem that many people normally have, but we needed to get photographs. And as we cleaned that cliff, something else showed up. Do you see right in the middle of our picture here? We have two snapped logs that are joined together in the middle. That tree was broken as it was deposited. That tree had been a whole tree once. It's the same tree. It's a pine tree, and it's full of iron now. Pine trees tend to petrify very quickly. In fact, there are many more softwoods in the fossil record turned to stone than there are hardwoods. Interesting puzzle to ponder. But this one has been snapped in two, obviously before it fossilized, and then the whole lot has been fossilized. As we went along a little further, now here's what's really interesting. This is the piece de resistance. You'll see the layers crossing the screen at the bottom. You'll see there's a second tree sitting on the top. Now what's interesting is these are both pine trees. These are both without roots. Now trees without roots don't grow on top of one another. It's as simple as that. You see the roots have been broken off, and the tree at the bottom has been broken off. That's why the tree at the top is sitting on it. We have two pine trees. In fact, these trees didn't grow there. They're both crossing many layers, and they're polystrate. Okay, if they didn't grow there, they've been picked up somewhere else. They grew somewhere else. They've been torn apart. They've been carried along by water. You know, at this point, I do think of Psalm 29, where the Lord spoke and the forests were destroyed. The Lord destroyed the cedars of Lebanon. The Lord sits as king of the flood. There's been a massive flood here, and it's picked up many trees. I mean, there's another one. I gave lectures on these, by the way, at the Sydney Basin Coal Conference. I gave lectures on them several years in a row. I actually presented papers to the International Coal Conference. And what you'll find is they're in abject denial. I mean, Professor Ian Plimer, who was the head of the department, as well as the chairman of the Sydney Basin Coal Conference, he basically got me kicked out. You see what he said? Oh, no, you can't. I better tell you because it's in my memory. See that tree? No branches, no roots. It's a polystrate tree. See all the layers it's going through? Now, when you have a look at these layers, there is no doubt about it that these coal trees go from one coal seam to another through. See those black layers it's running through? Each of those contains a separate amount of coal. And what Professor Ian Plimer, I mean, at the conference, I gave people directions. Here's where you can see these trees. Okay. And at the end of the conference, everyone could see, they could read the screen. And then after the conference, and the Australian geologist, Professor Ian Plimer, said there are no such trees, despite the first professor of geology at the university claiming there actually were trees. Because I've been back many, many times showing people some of these trees that are polystrate. I've even taken some noteworthy creationists. I took Professor Andy McIntosh down to see one of these trees. This tree here, notice it's full of iron. It's a polystrate petrified pine tree. Oh, there is one other interesting thing. You see, one of the professors in this region said the thing that's mystifying about these trees is they are pine trees, but there are no pine debris, as if it was a forest living there that was covered by volcanic ash. You see, there are tens of thousands of these fossil trees, and if this was a forest and then it was covered by volcanic ash, you would expect a layer of pine debris at the bottom, and there is none. There is pine bark scattered and turned to coal through the volcanic ash, but there is no pine debris. So as one professor said, this whole place looks like a flood deposit. It's been flooded in. Now, he didn't want you to think Noah's flood because that's anathema, but the whole basin looks like a washed in series of pine trees buried volcanic eruptions everywhere, and coalification as an end result. Well, Australia's not the only place this happens. I was in the UK and I was out on a search and I was looking for a very famous tree. It had been lost for quite a few years, so we went looking for it because we knew about it through this book, The Geology of the Manchester Area, by two famous professors, Eager and Broadhurst. Hey, looks like one of your relatives there, Diane.
Could be.
Okay. Yeah, the picture is on the back of the booklet, and it was available from the Geological Association, and we did find it, all covered up in muck, all covered up in lime and green stuff, hard to see, basically abandoned. So yours truly, not wishing things to stay in a dirty state, got in, and myself and my colleague, we cleaned it out. Look at that. Now you can see the tree clearly. You can see what looks like a tree base at the bottom. Well, why this tree is important is it actually is the first one to actually be associated with flooding. On page 56 of the Geology of Manchester Area, Broadhurst and Eager say this tree was apparently overwhelmed by flooding. Now, why would they say that? Why would they go on to use wording that would imply this is a flood deposit? Now, I'll be blunt. When I first started geology, as I've said many times in our programs, the professor was adamant we were not going to study such catastrophic rubbish as Noah's flood. We're not going to deal with flood deposition. It was anathema. And yet here we are finding in this geology guide about the region, this tree was covered by floods. Why? Well, there are many layers. You can see some of them there. In fact, if you get up close, you can see the edge of the tree has turned to coal. And then on either side, you will notice that there are actually layers. There's my friend helping me clean up. See above and to the near the top, opposite his cap, you'll see some of the layers. If you get even closer, you can see more layers. He and I are having a wonderful time doing a cleaning job. Well, he is. I'm actually taking photographs and supervising. What's the problem here? You see the layers go right up to the edge of the tree. Do you see that the layers, there are many of them? And this professor who wrote this report, he noticed one thing. Some of these layers had land plants in. Some of them had sea critters in. Some of them had swampy deposits. And he said, there's no way in the world this tree could have sat here in growth position, standing upright, while the land went up and down to form land fossils, then sea fossils, then marine fossils, then a mixture. He said the hundreds and hundreds of layers here can all have got washed in at one time to preserve this tree whole. This is a flood deposit. Oh, and you remember our two trees that were sitting one on top of the other? When we cleaned up this tree, we got an interesting surprise. It looked like there was another tree inside, and even it was surrounded by coal at the edge. What's interesting, of course, is we have here a very famous polystrate tree. See the multiple layers? Layer after layer after layer. The tree goes right up through the middle and looks like it's got a second tree underneath it. And each of those layers contains different fossils, microscopic, macroscopic, and as the professor rightly said, there's no way in the world that this tree could have stayed in the one position growing there while it was buried slowly by layer after layer of swamp or flood or sea. In fact, if you ponder it, for that to happen, the land had to bounce up and down like a yo-yo. One moment it's under the sea, next moment it's a coastal swamp, next moment it's dry land, then all over again in multiple layers. This was definitely a flood deposit. Now, I've traveled an awful lot over the years, so thank you to those of you who've donated so that we can actually get out there and see all of these things and record them before they disappear. Oh, disappear? You know that famous site that I showed you about in Australia? It's all gone now. The university didn't even step in and say, keep it, it's a valuable site. They just sold it off, and everything's been destroyed, filled in. Now, the beds I've been in are largely Carboniferous and Pennsylvania. In Australia, we had a big argument in Australia as to whether that tree bed was Carboniferous or what. We didn't want to use the English designation. And in America, they didn't want to use the English designation, but these are all the same bed. Carboniferous, Pennsylvanian. Carboniferous doesn't mean millions of years. It means full of carbon. And the name was invented by a clergyman. Pennsylvanian just means start looking in Pennsylvania. And one of my heroes in geology, Professor Derek Ager, in his Nature of the Stratigraphic Record, page 6 and 7. This is an interesting book because it's the only book I know of that's got basically an introduction dedicated to telling creationists not to use it. I'm not surprised. He says the Carboniferous, all the rocks I've been showing you, extends essentially from the Donetsk coalfield in Russia to Texas. Hey, Donetsk, that's where the fighting's all up there in the moment, the coal, the oil, etc., north of the Caspian Sea in the USSR. Okay, he says it extends all the way from Texas right across to Russia. That's pretty big, by the way. Look at that. This amounts to some 170 degrees of longitude. This is Professor Derek Ager, famous English professor. He didn't make too many people happy because he went round looking at what's actually there, not what's supposed to be there. And closing up the Atlantic by a mere 40 degrees doesn't do much. It just reduces the size of this field to 130 degrees. It doesn't help much in explaining this remarkable phenomena. And there are trees from Texas. How do I know? I've been there. There are trees in Tennessee. There are trees in Canada. How do I know? I've been there. There are trees right through England and Germany. How do I know? I've been there. You see, in reality, this flood deposit covers at least from the western side, the western middle of the USA, right across to the eastern side of southern Russia. But what's even more, you know where else I've seen these trees? I was down in Western Australia in one of our coal mines. You see, it sits on granite. No doubt about it, the granite has been flood eroded. It's been cleaned up, and what's been dumped on top of it has been coal with fossil trees in it. I've got no doubt about it. These trees, which have been ripped up, carried along and buried, are worldwide. Now, can I encourage you? All the research we're doing, I'm going to get Sam to bring the whole screen up in a moment. That research we're doing, if you're enjoying it, before I get to part 2, it actually does need your support. So if you want to help us with the costs of that, you might be able to use the stuff through this at the moment, but you can use PayPal. We'd encourage you to support the work that Diane does, the work that Joe does, the work that we do. It does cost, and we love bringing it to you, and we love showing you off our brand new Sam Design logo, but would encourage you to actually support. So before we go one step further and I look at how this happens, let's see if there's any questions that have come in. Sam?
Yeah, certainly. We have someone called Brainbug in the chat who has a YouTube channel who seems to take a bit of an interest in Joe, actually. I don't know if I should be concerned. But he's asking the question of who is IDing those polystrate trees as pine trees. He seems to have an issue with the fact that they're not pine trees. He's saying they're mostly lycopods and club moss. They did fill a similar niche to trees.
Okay, the one that's in Australia are provably pine trees. They've been ID'd over and over again by university professors, Newcastle University, right from the earliest days. The ones that I showed you in England is definitely a lycopod tree, right? So I didn't call it a pine tree. I only used that term for the ones in Australia. Good question, an important one to know. The way you can find out is when you cut through a pine tree, you will actually see not only rings, you will see the vertical canals. So you'll see a pine tree has rings going around it, and it also has the horizontal feeder canals, which is a unique characteristic of the conifer family. And as I said before, there are far more softwood fossils because I think the actual pine material with a double set of canals can actually get the petrification of materials far more easily in. If you like an interesting thing, was it Brainbug he called himself, Sam?
Yeah, his channel is called Brainbug.
Okay. If you're interested in, one year we did a total analysis of what's in these trees, and they follow a distinct pattern. There's a lot of iron in our soils in Australia, even in the coal fields. Our red colour in Australia is often to do with the migration of iron. And when you come up from the bottom, you find the chemistry of the tree is actually working like, do you remember those old-fashioned bits of blotter you would use, Joe, to actually separate chemicals? You remember them, Diane? You basically hung them up.
Chromatography, it's called.
Yeah, chromatography, right? You would race the chemicals up. Some chemicals didn't weigh as much, so they'd reach the top first. Some would be really heavy, they'd stay at the bottom. So you could actually separate the chemicals in a mix and say, oh, it was 10% this, 5% that, 20% that. And pine trees function as a huge chromatograph. So you have the heavy metals separate around the bottom, and then you have coalification at the top, and you have silica, which is basically going right through the tree. It comes in a liquid form. So the tree is petrified in silica at the top, it's iron in the middle, and it's actually iron carbonate around the bottom. So a really interesting chromatograph. But the interesting thing, of course, is the tree is cold only on the outside. So it's a great batch of chemistry. The coal is forming only because the clay can access the outside of the tree, and coal does not form by anything sitting in a swamp. It forms because of the action of microscopic particles of coal that are degrading the hydrocarbons until they only have carbon. So even we have pulled those pine trees apart and looked at their chemistry. Whereas if you go to the lycopods, the one I showed you in England, remember my friend who was cleaning up while I was photographing? The inside of those trees, even in the present world, we still have lycopods, and they're hollow. They only have a carbon section on the outside, so they fill up with mud by and large. I've even found them where they've got fossil fishes and things like that inside them. You get breaks occurring in the tree, the water will pour in and bring whatever around it. But the outside of that has got enough carbon in. If there's enough ash in the mud, enough clay in the mud, you will find they go to coal as well. Hence the blackness that you saw up to about that thick. They don't mind the trees for their coal because there's so little coal in the tree. But they are a bit of a problem in some English mines because the bottom is shaped like this, right? And often the iron will sit in that bottom, and they're called kettles at that stage, and they can kill you. You're digging a coal mine, then this kettle will slide out nicely, land on your head, and squash you flatter than a snake's belly, which is not a very livable experience. It's a cause of many fatalities in the old English mines. So that's sort of a bit of the biology of them. So thank you for the question.
Yeah, I've been to both the pine trees that are in Australia down in Newcastle. You took me down there, John, when I was in Australia a few years back. Araucaria and the pine trees in general, the southern conifers, they're very, very distinctive, aren't they, John, when you actually know what you're looking for. And then you have lycopods, which are also very, very distinctive as well. So you can very quickly tell the difference between the two once you've actually been out there and dug them up. So you've taken me all down through Tennessee and into Kentucky, and we've looked at all the polystrate trees down there, and they're all lycopods. I can take you to the UK, and I've been to the tree where John pointed out near Manchester, but they also turn up along Northumberland and up along the Whitby coast, where you kind of go from the Jurassic rocks and you get to the Carboniferous rocks a bit further north. They're full of these polystrate trees, and they're all lycopods, identical to the ones over in Tennessee, but very, very different to the ones that you see down in Australia and Newcastle. So
I'll just add one more comment there, Joe. You may have remembered that I mentioned just briefly that in the early days of Australia, they didn't know whether to classify our rocks as carboniferous or the equivalent of Pennsylvania, or to put it in your terms in England, lower carboniferous and upper carboniferous, right? And the reason was very simple. In the coastal rocks that were the first ones, I mean, when Oxley in the early days sailed north to head to Brisbane, or Flinders sailed north to sail around Australia. He's the guy, by the way, who called it Australia Felix. So that's where our name comes from. Australia simply meaning southern. So it's the southern place of great joy in that, Australia Felix. But he's the one who noticed the coal seams at Newcastle. And what you'll find is those ones are all pine trees. But as you proceed inwards, then you'll find some of the lycopods start showing up. So a big argument occurred as to whether it matched the Carboniferous lower or the upper part of that lower Carboniferous. And we resolved it in terms of, hey, we want to be Australians. These are unique. They don't have the pine trees much over there in England. But then I've travelled and I did a paper for the Newcastle Coal Board, and they took me down into the Butterwell mine, and guess what this Aussie found? Because the locals weren't looking for it. Here's an enormous pine tree, an enormous Oricaria, and Joe, you know very well, above that you have many Oricaria fossils in England, the softwood pine trees, and they are one of the commonest fossils over there. So you do have pine trees in the coal. So perhaps it never needed to be a fight after all, but geologists love fighting over classifications and names and dates.
And by the way, this is one of the reasons why I'm so grateful that as John travelled, he collected stuff, not just fossils, but also books and papers and articles and everything. And when I took over the ministry in the UK, I sort of semi-inherited all of this. So we actually have John's original book where it talks about those fossils. There's the fossil tree on the back page, and there's page 56, complete with all of John's scribbles and notes, where it clearly says, look at what the evidence says, it's been inundated by flooding. So it's, and this is a proper geology book, by the way. It tells you turn around here, turn left, walk 500 feet, turn around, and you'll find this fossil. So it is really, really useful for actually going out and doing research yourself, and it's the basis of a lot of field trips that we do here in the UK as well.
Because the sad thing, Joe, is many of these aren't even available anymore.
Oh yeah, this has been out of print for a while, so you know, to be able to have a copy is quite spectacular, and it's another one of the reasons why, if there's a good book that comes out, we try and grab it before it goes out of print, as it inevitably will do at some point, because it contains so much great information, particularly in terms of you know, where to go to find stuff and research like that. So
all right, I'll take over to part two, because I think that's important now. Now, creation research, as Joe said, exists to give good news projects, to tell you the exciting stuff that there's much criticism of Noah's flood and the Bible, whether it be by groups who say they believe the Bible, but when you push them to the wall, they actually believe the professors first. So we do our best to try and give you good news projects down under as well as up over. Now, if you're wondering how these trees end up standing vertically, here's an example. Okay, there's a dam. We're in Kentucky. It's another one of those just north of the southern line there. We're in the Dixieland area, and this dam is drying out. Great place for research. Can you see all the trees that are lying around it? But I wasn't interested in those trees. I was interested in these ones. Do you notice that's the branch there? It's not connected at the top end. You can go down, it's not connected to the bottom end. But what you find is it's floating vertically. So is this one. Oh, and there's one that's floating horizontally alongside of it. And if you photograph the whole lot, then you find, if you pull back, the trees are in various states of actually sinking. They come into the water, they float horizontally. They begin to soak up water, and they end up diagonally. And then they finally go vertical, and then they slowly sink to the bottom. You'll see one on the right-hand middle there, just below that big inclined tree. It's standing upright, but it's under the water. You will see a tree to the top right-hand side there. You can't see the top because it started to sink. Now, what's going on? At Jurassic Ark, we have a polystrate test tank. So now that Australia is open, now that they're starting to let schools come back, now that we have a group booked in the week before Easter, those of you in Australia listening, make sure you get up to Queensland Just like we can go down to Victoria now. Great stuff. I hope they don't close the borders again. I've been caught twice like that. Cost me 2 weeks each time of quarantine. Okay, so there's our curator, Daryl. And what have we got? Yes, one old fish tank. And we've put logs in it. Just little logs, of course. So you get up close. There they are. Day one. All floating on the top. We just went round our forest. Our forest is a collection of pine trees and gum trees, native trees, and we just picked up the branches that have been sitting on the ground. Okay, there we are at the end of day one. Notice they're all horizontal. Now, in case you're wondering about this, I first came across this phenomena, or it's first mentioned anyway, in a record from the Admiralty. Now, you British people have got a big advantage over most others. Your Admiralty hates throwing things away. And so you've got records for hundreds of years what Her Majesty's ships have been doing and why you, Captain, why did you run our ship into a tree? Yes, he did. It's recorded. He was in serious trouble because he reported that Your Majesty's servants, I happened to run into a tree in the middle of the ocean and it was standing upright. Bit of a mystery. Well, there's day three. You'll see our trees. They are all, oh, look at the one right in the front. It's not on the bottom. Look at the one just on the right of my camera there. You'll notice it's inclined. Look at the one on the right-hand side. It hasn't got to the bottom either. So when you have a look at these trees, that's our polystrate test tank. And in fact, if you keep going, then what you'll find is this. Okay, within 2 days, and by the start of the third day, you find many of the trees are standing upright. Some are still at the top. Some will stay at the top for a month, but then they'll all end up sinking. And then after they've stood upright for a few days, then they'll gradually incline and end up flat on the bottom. It's not the result of time. It's the result of a process. But what process? Well, some of you know that anybody who's an engineer has a jealousy fit when it comes to designing pumps. You have a tree that's 40 feet, 20 meters, 30 feet, 60 feet high. It's pumping water from the roots up to the top. And there's not even using an electric motor. The amount of pressure needed to pump water up a tree is unbelievable. But the water starts at the bottom and goes to the top. And it does this whether it's alive or whether it's dead. This process still occurs even when the branch is chopped off the tree. We'll come back to that in open question time. But it does produce something that people have noticed. There's a real conflict of the long, slow burial of trees, the story of how they sat in the swamp and slowly got buried. There's a big conflict with that story versus Christianity. How do I know? Here's two teachers. I took them on the field trip. You see the fossil tree in front of the teacher who's touching it? Okay, now he used to be an unbeliever. He used to be atheistic. He didn't believe at all. Now he does. He's not only that, he was the head of the science department. Why would he become a Christian? You see, Mark actually got to see all of these trees. These trees stood upright. They didn't have roots. They didn't have branches. Mark got to see that they couldn't have grown there. I mean, trees without roots don't grow anywhere. Trees without branches don't do very well at all. Something else had to be happened. And slowly but surely, Mark came to see that the story of Noah's flood, with the destruction of trees even mentioned in Psalm 29, simply by God using his voice, he could believe it. I'm not surprised Mark became a Christian. If they do not hear Moses and the prophets, said Jesus, neither will they be persuaded, though one rise from the dead. Now, for those of you who are struggling with what Biologos says, or theistic evolutionists, don't be surprised, because you can't claim to believe Moses and then turn around and say you believe the professors when they're saying two different things. Jesus himself said if people don't believe Moses and the prophets, they will not be persuaded, even through a tiddling little resurrection. Now, when was the last time you went to a decent resurrection? Let's be honest. a resurrection from the dead. If someone's been dead for 3 days, they should stink. But if they get out of their grave and walk out, it should shock you at the very least. But Jesus said, if you don't believe Moses, this won't affect you at all. So let's rephrase this. Jesus said, if people do hear, listen, accept, believe Moses and the prophets, you see, I put it in the positive. They can be persuaded through one rising from the dead. That's why Mark's now a Christian. You see, Mark believed that, and he could see that Jesus meant what he said what he meant, and could do everything that he said he could do. Now, can I encourage you? Creation research is not simply about digging up trees and fossils. Creation research does the research not just to show people, hey, we got a clever Sam who made up a pretty logo, and we actually added the inclined rainbow reflecting CD behind it. We do it because when people ask us why should they be Christians, we can do what Peter said. When people ask you a question, give them an answer for a reason, for the hope that lies within you. And if you are a Christian, you know one thing. The Bible says Jesus Christ is the hope that lies within you. The reason for creation, Christ is the creator and he doesn't lie. The reason you believe Noah's flood, Christ is the one whose word sent the flood. He's the one who alone, what did he say? I am the way, the truth, and the life, and I am your peace. He is the one who gives us peace. So those of you who are doubting, cease your doubts now. Put your faith in Christ, because the evidence is all there, and on Judgment Day, it's this evidence which God will use against you when you say, oh, I couldn't believe because there was a nasty church. Well, I'm sorry, it won't do you any good. Let's go back to full screen, Sam. And if anyone got any questions before Joe takes over to do his section, let's take one or two at the moment.
Certainly do. We have another question from Brainbug directed towards Joe. Joe, where is your hat? Your hat is missing. Oh, drum roll, please. There we go. There we are. Right, if we've got a question, sorry, I promised Brainbug I'd ask, so there you go. Right, got a question from Neil Grindley. He says, Joe, didn't a polystrate tree show an unbelieving scientist get mysteriously buried shortly afterwards?
I think he's talking about one of my recollections, Joe. Correct?
Possibly.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'll tell you my experience here, and if Joe gets his microphone to work again, we might be able to hear what he says. I used to lecture in geology, and many of my students were mining engineers. As I always used to tell them, they were the worst students I ever had because they were interested in engineering, not interested too much in geology. So we endured one another, but some of them became mine directors and mine engineers and things like that. And so I would visit them on the mining fields. And I had one student that I visited in central Queensland, and I said, okay, and all the time you've been here, have you seen any trees standing upright without roots, without branches? And he said, no, not once. I said, really? He said, I haven't even seen any trees in this mine. And I scratched my head and I thought, get me permission to come in and I'll show you them in 10 minutes. Because you see, I was very familiar with his mining field, even though I hadn't been in his mine beforehand. So we got permission to go in the mine on the day when they weren't working that section. There's a lot of danger hazards in mines, so don't just wander into them of your own free will. You may end up dead or seriously injured. So we went to a face, and within 10 minutes, he's saying, wow, I didn't see these before. They're black like the coal, but look, some of them are standing upright. There's hundreds of them. Now, I guess as a young mining engineer, he may not have had too much discretion, because he went back to his boss and he said, you know, you told us there wouldn't be any fossil trees or any evidence. This was laid down rapidly. And the boss said, yes. He said, well, I've just disproved everything you've said. Now, that probably wasn't the wisest way to introduce the subject, because the next day when that section of the mine was opened again, they blew them all up, right? So that does happen. And then they just get carted out, used as coal, filtered out, and nobody ever sees them again. So that sort of thing really does happen to evidence. As much as you like to think scientists and geologists are, actually objective, this is very rarely the case. Joe, you thought of any evidence, any example of yours?
So I'll tell you a place called Hunstanton, which I did my first ever paper on, and it was a big section of my dissertation, where in my first degree, got taken there for a university field trip. Now, I'd been collecting stuff from Hunstanton for years before that, right? I'd led field trips there. I'd taken you, John, out to Hunstanton. We'd done loads of stuff. And Hunstanton is pretty beautiful because it has sandstone at the bottom, a sort of a lovely sort of honey, sort of light brown kind of coloured sandstone at the bottom called carstone. Then it has a layer of red chalk, deep red chalk. Then it has a layer of grey chalk. And we were going down there on our university field trip, and one of the things that the professor was pointing out over and over again as we were walking down, right? Now, one of the things we like to do on our field trips is get people to go and dig stuff up, right? Go and actually see what the evidence says. This was more of a sort of a lecture on the beach. And he kept saying, one thing that we know is that the carstone and the chalk was laid down in a marine environment, a shallow marine environment. And I said, excuse me, Prof, what about the fossil wood that's here at the carstone? And he said, there's no such thing as any fossil wood here at Hunstanton or in the carstone. I said, yes, there is. Let me show you. So he took him over and pointed out the fossil wood that I'd found in the carstone, right? Now, I have samples of this fossil wood. It's down there in the museum. We actually, it wasn't unheard of because there are samples of this fossil wood in the Sedgwick Museum in Cambridge. Now, Cambridge isn't a million miles away from Hunstanton in Norfolk. And the Sedgwick Museum is interesting because it was founded by Adam Sedgwick, who was a big critic of Darwin and the theory of evolution, and he said, I want to make sure that anybody has access to all of my fossils at any point, right? So you sign the forms, you can go behind the scenes, but there's something ridiculous like 500,000 fossils on display in the Sedgwick Museum. It's just pile after pile after pile, right? And if you go to or if you used to, when you go to the area where there's all the fossils from Hunstanton, there's a big chunk of carstone with fossil wood in it. So this isn't, unheard of. And I took the professor over and I said, have a look at this. Here's your fossil wood I've collected from here. And he said, well, I never. I said, so how does this fossil wood fit in with your, this is all marine? He said, maybe it could have got washed out here. I said, well, there's plenty of examples. And I said, and it's all pointing in the same direction. So it's definitely washed here, but this has to be washed here in a flood. And he said, well, it can't be. You'd never get any. I said, okay, well, you have a think about that and see what you think. He said, yeah, I'm going to have to think about this and try and work something out. Anyway, two things then happened. Next year, I was still on the Facebook group, right, for all the students. And they just basically reused the Facebook group and added the new students into it. And I saw that they were coming up for a field trip on this module that I'd done the year previously. And I waited until it was ended and I said, oh, by the way, did the professor mention anything about the fossil wood? And they said, fossil wood? We didn't see anything about fossil wood there. I said, oh, did he mention the fossil wood? And did he give any explanation for how it got there or anything? He said, oh, no, there's no mention of fossil wood. He said it was all marine. There's no way that there was anything terrestrial here. I said, oh, that's interesting. Because I know I pointed out to him the day before, or the year before. Anyway, a few weeks later, I was going back to the Sedgwick Museum in Cambridge. That fossil wood has disappeared. And I've since been into the archives, and I mean, you can spend hours and hours and weeks in the archives, so I not see everything. But I went through all of the Hunstanton stuff, even in the archives. There's no mention of that fossil wood. There's no, it's just completely disappeared. And what's interesting is, having been in touch with other students who are still doing the same stuff, who's associated with Cambridge, there's still no mention of the fossil wood at Hunstanton or anything else. So I'm grateful that I've collected samples, and it's one of the things that we point out when we lead field trips now to Hunstanton, because although you could never prove it, it certainly seems like things go missing if it doesn't quite fit in with the paradigm.
Any other questions there? Be sure, Sam, you take over, Joe.
This one probably here from Neil. I thought it was Joe, and an exhibit of an animal that upsettionist pointed out in a museum was put into the basement.
I think it was probably that one. That's my only experience that I've had with that. John's been around a lot more and has provoked a lot more people, so it probably has happened more to him.
It's happened a lot of times, and I think you probably should mention, Joe, that the professor on the beach had actually done his thesis on Hunstand, if I remember correctly.
Yes, that is correct.
And yes, things do disappear into the basement. The most famous one in sort of creation versus evolution cycles is the Guadalupe woman, and I visited Guadalupe to go and excavate there and found out that the whole segment where the fossil woman had been, and she was a fossil woman, she's locked up in petrified corals and things like that, is actually, or it was actually, in the basement, and full marks to Chris Stringer for actually even apologizing that they'd been wrong in what they said about the Guadalupe woman and its positioning in the actual rocks, because I went and mapped the whole area and deliberately gave it to him. So yes, there are lots of these that used to be on display that have been removed, but then there's a really good excuse for doing that. Joseph, how many fossils do you have in your collection?
That's a good question.
Some would say too many.
Yeah, well, my wife would say too many too. You can go and agree with her. It's somewhere between 12 to 15,000. We don't know the exact number, but it's a lot, yes.
Okay, and I have 10 times more than that. And in reality, you can't put everything on display anyway. So we do need to remember that in many museums, and I'm pretty sure what they've done at the Sedgwick Museum, because I was there many, many years ago after I did a debate at Oxford against one of the geology professors. So I know what was on display there, and they have deliberately removed that, and they've deliberately fudged the documents too to get rid of it, evidence out of the actual accreditation that they used to have this. So that is deliberate. But museums have adopted a policy, particularly since the 1930s, of only putting fossils on display that match the current in theory. If the in theory is evolution over millions of years and slow marine deposition of Hunstand, sorry, any evidence to the contrary is removed out and denied. Right? Not just removed, but it's denied. So those of you who think scientists are nice little old men or ladies who wear white coats and they're totally objective, sorry, this is not true. They are prejudiced by the acceptable paradigm, the one that will get them their grants.
Absolutely. By the way, Isabella, who's commented about a field trip to Hunstanton, 2nd of July, write it in your diary. Tickets will be up soon. We're doing a field trip to Hunstanton. Keep an eye out. If you sign up to our UK newsletter, you will find all of the up-to-date details of field trips and events. If you can make it down to Dorset at the end of September, that's when we have our fossil convention, which is sort of going to be slightly aimed around home educating families just because of the dates, right? But come along to that if you can. Lots of field trips down there and fossil hunting. But yeah, for Hunstanton, it'll be the 2nd of July. There'll be tickets available very, very shortly. So keep an eye out on our websites for that. Well, I'm going to do a brief little talk about the flood and some of the geological evidence, which I will just get up onto my screen now. And it's only going to be very, very brief because we haven't got a lot of time. So I've kind of chopped down my my program as it is anyway. So let's just pull this up and then share the screen. I think it's this one. There we go. You should be able to see that. Okay. Cheddar Gorge in the UK. This is about as close as we get to the Grand Canyon. It's not as impressive as the Grand Canyon, but you would be surprised. It is pretty spectacular. What is it there? It's Carboniferous limestone. There's the gorge that kind of runs down through the through the centre of Cheddar Gorge. Cheddar, by the way, for all of you Americans, is where cheddar cheese originally comes from, and not the slimy, horrible yellow stuff that you have. I'm talking proper cheddar cheese, right? Sort of knock your socks off kind of cheddar cheese. It's matured in the caves, because there are caves running down all through this Carboniferous limestone. And yes, they get the cheese and they wrap it up and they store it in the caves because it's nice and cool and damp. And it matures there for weeks to months to even years sometimes. And it tastes absolutely wonderful. Of course, if you go to Cheddar Gorge, not only do you get to taste the cheese, you also get some wonderful geology. There's the scene from the top of the gorge. Yeah, it's pretty high. You get great views over the landscape, and you also get to go down into the gorge and collect some fossils. There I am collecting fossils, and you can see all the little sort of white specks. They are all fossil brachiopods. Brachiopods, sea creatures. It's a marine rock full of these sea creatures, full of these brachiopods. Absolutely chock-a-block full of them. You can go digging through all of the rubble there and find absolutely masses of fossils. Hey, Cheddar Gorge would be a good place to do a field trip. You get to go down into the caves as well. There's your brachiopods, plenty of them, buried in water, all washed together, dumped down very quickly, definitely evidence of a flood. Now, here's the plaque outside of the Cheddar Gorge cave. It says this plaque represents the sister cave relationship between Cheddar Show Caves and Jenolan Caves, New South Wales in Australia. Now, John, you've been to Jenolan Caves, but then so have I. Here we are in the Blue Mountains in Australia. It's, again, a bit like a Grand Canyon, although this one's probably closer to the size. The difference is, of course, it's not really a desert. It's absolutely full of vegetation. And it's absolutely beautiful as well. And you can go down into Jenolan Caves. And I did. A couple of supporters, while we were down in the Blue Mountains, took me out, and I had the privilege of visiting the Jenolan Caves, going inside, having a bit of a dig around. It's Carboniferous limestone. It's the same limestone. It's the same limestone as the stuff that's back at Cheddar Gorge. Not only are they twin caves, they're twin geological formations as well. And guess what's inside them? Brachiopods. That's quite a bit of distance, 10,500 miles or 16,000 kilometers, and yet it's the same geology, it's the same limestone, it's the same fossils. That is a big flood. You can go one step further and look at some other limestone formations as well. This is in Carthage in Tennessee. John took me out there in 2019. I've been out there a couple of times since then, and some great fossils from the limestone. I told you too quickly. What's the rock type? This is limestone, but it's not Carboniferous limestone this time. It's Ordovician limestone. Still limestone, still pretty spectacular fossils that you can get out of it. Pretty spectacular road cuts as well. And one of the great things I love about the USA is that, generally speaking, you can just pull up at the side of a road cut where it's gone through the geology, and you can get out, pull your car over, get out and go digging. And look at what you find. More brachiopods. Absolutely chock-a-block full of them. Brachiopod shells. There they are, squashed together. You also find some other interesting fossils around the area. This is just up the road from where our big supporters live. A wonderful crinoid fossil mess. I mean, they've just been broken up and crushed and smushed together in a great big mass mess. Definitely a flooding event. And the point that we like to make is simple. It's got nothing to do with time, but everything to do with the process. If you want to get these fossil deposits on the size that they are, not only do you need a big flood, but you need a big flood that actually produces the correct process. This is one of the things that we're doing with our strata machines. We're having a look at that process. We spoke earlier about permineralization. We're talking about a process. We've been speaking about polystrate trees, and to get them, we're talking about a process. All right, go to the Lake District in the UK. Again, stunning scenery, beautiful stuff. And guess what you find there? More Ordovician limestone. Hey, we've compared the Carboniferous limestone from the UK and Australia. Now we're having a look at Ordovician limestone and comparing it from the UK to the USA. Well, we're in a cave called Yoder's Cave here. You go down into the cave and there's a waterfall. You've got some beautiful stalactites and stalagmites down there as well. Me and John spent many hours wandering around this cave, collecting samples, taking pH measurements of the water coming from the waterfall, the water that's been on the cave floor, the water that's dripping from the stalactites and the stalagmites. Beautiful limestone formations all around, absolutely glorious. And guess what you're finding in there as well? More brachiopod shells from the Ordovician limestone of the UK. Brecon beacons in Wales, a lot further south than up in the Lake District. And guess what you find? Some beautiful trilobites. Hey, we were finding trilobites in Tennessee, weren't we, John? Beautiful trilobites.
Yeah, and those two are my trilobites, if I remember correctly.
They're your trilobites. They're here on display in the UK Museum collection. This is where I took the photos of them. Absolutely beautiful, gorgeous. And look what we were finding in Tennessee. Trilobites. This is the back end of a trilobite, but still, 4,000 miles, 6,500 kilometers. That is still a really big flood. The same formation, the same fossils, the same geology from the USA to the UK. And you remember the same fossils that were here in the UK and the Carboniferous limestone being twinned with the same fossils and the same formation and the same location down in Australia? That's a really, really big flood. Now, you realise to get these kind of sizes of formations, I mean, John was talking to us earlier about the Carboniferous rocks, right, which go all over the world. That's a really big flood. Here we're talking about limestones, two different types of limestones. One goes from the USA to the UK, one goes from the UK to Australia. These are really big floods that we're talking about. And the point, it's got nothing to do with time, but everything to do with the process. Get the process right, it happens quickly. But it's not a case of get the process right, it happens quickly, get the process wrong, it takes a long time. Any rock formation which has fossils in them, it has to be the correct process, and the process has to be quick. If you have it slow, you simply will not get any fossils in the slightest. So there's a few interesting little thoughts for you about some of our geology in the UK and Australia and in the USA as well. But we'll just leave it at that for now, because we've got about 10 minutes left or so before we have to kind of round up. So let's have a look and see if there are any final questions before we close up, and get any final comments from John.
We certainly do. Just a quick one again from Brainbug. He's asking if there's any information he can look up about the Guadalupe woman.
I don't even know if the British Naturalist Museum has an article on it still.
No,
when I was the editor of the Creation magazine in the early days, you will find my first report. I went to Guadalupe, which is on the edge of South America, went to the right place, looked at the fossils, found a fossil dog, by the way. Very interesting. So in those coral reefs, which are basically uplifted, and so they are now the actual rock of the island, you will find there's lots of fossils that have been preserved from that uplift. So we wrote the article in the Creation magazine, ex nihilo, and then we wrote in the technical journal a big long report as well. So you may have to look up those, which will also, I published for Chris Stringer, who was a bit upset with me for actually doing that. I said, if you want to publish an article, you go right ahead and I'll print it for you. So there's an article from the Naturalist Museum, because I have no problem if his facts are wrong, it's going to show. So we have no problem with dealing with opposition. So for those of you who are educating, make sure your kids know about evolution and they know what's wrong with it, right? They know how to think about it, not just what to think about it. They know how to think about it too. So that's what I suspect is your first and only source of those. I don't think they were entered into the museum archives, although, as I said before, I gave full marks to Chris Stringer for actually admitting that our mapping was really great and spot on.
By the way, Chris Stringer is the guy who has the skeleton in the basement and is the one who gave us the figure of, was it 10,000 fossil humans? No?
30,000.
30,000 fossil humans.
30,000.
Yeah.
And he hasn't withdrawn that figure. I've used it in debates at universities in the UK, used it on television. It's had every opportunity. And you've only got to wander around the globe like you and I do, Joseph, and you come across fossil human after fossil human or fragments thereof all over the planet.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Any final questions before we begin?
Yes, we do. Okay, so this is coming from Young Earth Creation, came in right at the beginning of the show, but it sort of went a bit quickly, so we didn't have time to get through it. So he says, radioactive elements are what they use to date rock layers. Are they distributed via density and weight? And that is why heavy uranium that dates oldest is deeper. He also goes to say, also, you test this in your simulation without having to use actual radioactive elements. Is there another piratical you can use that can replicate these different elements' atomic weight? This would explain the elements in the upper crust because of Noah's flood over deep time, but also explain their arrangement. Okay,
I'll make a brief comment, then Joe can take over. No, unless you have the right licenses, you will not be able to do a simulation unless you have the actual radioactive elements. One of our guys is a qualified radioactivity person, so there are some things that we can run brief checks on. He's licensed to actually do radiation experiments, and so he's a really great source of information. But the major part of your question is not actually factual. We find radioactive sands that have washed out of rocks onto beaches, so they're actually at the surface at the moment. When I was younger, I worked up near our uranium mine, Mary Kathleen, and it was mined at the surface, right? So you'll find that deep in terms of structure probably is a comment on those who already believe the age of the rocks before you start finding uranium in them. So, Joe, you got any comments?
You've covered most of it. Just remember that we keep having this sort of comment come back about, we need to deal with radioactive fatigue, we need to deal with radioactive dating, radiometric dating, carbon-14, all this kind of stuff. Because there's a belief out there that it was these processes, these calculations, these dating methods, which this is how we know that the Earth is really, really old. And as we dealt with carbon-14 and we dealt with radioactivity last week, scientists believed that the Earth was old long before any kind of carbon-14, carbon dating, radioactive dating, or anything like that came about. So you'll find all of these methods start off with the pre-belief that the Earth is very old, and so they're going to be interpreted and they're going to be things are going to be analysed first and foremost through the beliefs that the world is very old. These are created to show the world the Earth is old and not the other way around. So you've got to be careful of any of those assumptions sneaking into your understanding of these dating methods and how they work. So just a word of caution there.
And Joe, probably a good point in time, we'll be on Donnie's show in a couple of weeks' time dealing with boundaries and geologic columns.
Yeah.
You want to mention that?
We're doing a special two-parter over 2 days, and I can't remember when the days are, but it's beginning of April. John and I will be tag teaming it, so we'll be presenting a little bit on each day. We're going to have a start off by, you see, Donnie's asked us to deal with the subject of the flood and the post-flood boundary. Well, it's a very interesting topic, but really you're going to get nowhere unless you understand A, the history of geology, B, where the thinking in geology came from in the first place, because that's what gives us this perception of a line, right? And then thirdly, we need to actually understand how do sediments behave. Can you simply create a line that's flood, post-flood, or anything else? So before we even get onto the flood, post-flood boundary, or the flood, pre-flood boundary for that matter, we need to understand the history of geology. We need to understand where geological thinking came from. We also need to understand how sediments work and move and get transported in the real world. Well, there's simply just not enough time to deal. I mean, I tried tackling it with Donnie a little while back, right? And we did like a 3 or 4 hour program. It was ridiculous, and I was exhausted by the end of it, and we barely scratched the surface. So we're doing over 2 days. Both myself and John will be dealing with it, and we're going to have a chat and make sure that we've got everything up to scratch before we do that. So it promises to be a very good program, a very in-depth program, slightly technical, but well worth it. So keep an eye out on Standing for Truth for that. And they'll be coming up early April, beginning of April.
Yeah, I think that's the 4th and 5th, Joe. They can check that on the Standing for Truth's website. Probably time for me just to close off now. 2 things. Joe's had plenty of opportunity to promote his September conference. You just heard some of Diane's beautiful songbirds outside. So don't forget to sign up for our print newsletter as well as our electronic newsletter. And don't forget, we're having an Easter convention in Melbourne. First time we've been basically allowed to do ministry in a couple of years. We're really rejoicing in that. So join us for the Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and the Monday, just outside of Bendigo on the Goldfields. In fact, you can tell it's the Goldfields because it's not far from Hangman's Lane. What an address, hey? I guess it was pretty wild country back there in the early days. But just to finish off this section here, remember the last 2 verses of that psalm that we read, Psalm 29? It says, the Lord sits as king of the flood. The flood was sent as judgment. Though we know it's Noah's flood, it's not any other flood, because it uses that exclusive Hebrew word mabul. The Lord sits as the judge of the flood that was sent to destroy. And except for Noah and his family, everybody else that wasn't on the ark, everything that wasn't on the ark that breathed the breath of air died. They were all judged. People don't like Psalm 29 because it reminds you that God is a judge. But it doesn't finish there. It finishes with the next verse that says, the Lord blesses his people with peace forever. Can I encourage you, if you only know about the Creator, you need to know the Creator, who is Jesus Christ, because he alone in these days of war, in these end times of where you get all sorts of discussions of Gog and Magog. And by the way, we've had those since Napoleon invaded Russia, Gog versus Magog. The Jews saw that parallel themselves. But we're not talking about the peace that comes when those wars are cancelled. We're talking about the peace that comes only from God the Creator, who is Jesus Christ, who alone can give you the salvation you need in a troubled world. So make sure you get to know him as your Lord and Savior. Okay, I'm done. Any other comments, Joe?
No, I think that's great. I think we've just about wrapped everything up. So thank you all very much for listening and for watching. I just noticed there was a comment from Kirk Wilson. It's good to see you, Kirk, and I need to get back over to the States when they let me in. Just as a point, we know that there's a problem with the USA shop. We've tried to fix it, and it hasn't worked. We're working on a few other things, but if you want to get in touch with Creation Research USA, the best thing to do is to email our head office in Australia, and they'll probably be able to put you in touch with the Carmans, and now also Glenn Wilson, who is
and Jamie and Rob. They're
starting to celebrate there. So anyway, we'll get in touch with John and the others, and we'll go that way. Anyway, be sure to join us next week. Be sure to join us for our convention down on the South Coast coming up. Be sure to join us on the many other field trips we're planning and getting organised in the future. So goodbye, God bless. We will catch you later. Any last words from the rest of the team?
No.
If you would like some more details about that question on the local flood versus worldwide flood, you can go to our Ask site, our question and answer site, and you'll see it there. If you just put in local flood or Biologos, because that's what stimulated someone to write into us and ask for an answer.
Sure. Great stuff. Thank you very much, guys. Catch you later. See you next week.
Goodbye.